Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Endgame class. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and tonight I am going to be walking you through some really fun endgames involving having a rook against not one, but two minor pieces. Now, this is a really interesting imbalance that most people get well acquainted with early on in their chess career, thanks to some early sacrifices on f2, but maybe you shouldn't be doing it. Beginners just love giving up two minor pieces on f2 against a castled king for that rook on f1. Won't get into that though, because that's not the end game. That happens earlier on. But let's look at the really interesting imbalance as it happens in the endgame. So let's just jump right into it here. I have, from deep in my files, deep in my files, had to go underground for this one, searching through the stacks of chess games I've played in my career. We have a game between the one, the only, the child prodigy, Rochelle Wu, who I believe made her debut in the U.S. U.S. Girls Junior Championship this year against myself. And this is back in 2016 at a tournament here at the St. Louis Chess Club. And at the time, I really didn't know who Rochelle was or who she would go on to be, but she gave me a really tough time in this game, and I wanted to start actually from the opening, not spending too much time because, of course, we are focusing on the endgame here, but it's worth taking a note to see how we got there. We had a Caro-Kann, knight c3, the classical variation, normal stuff, you know, who cares, it's the opening, go. And then got a little bit out of theory when Rochelle played this interesting move, knight to e4. Didn't really know what was going on here. Doesn't really matter for the most part though. We see knight f takes d4, and then I sort of lost my nerve here. I was worried about getting checked. Getting checked is very, very scary, so I tried to stop it with queen b4. This turned out to be wrong though, and Rochelle gets a really nice position. Thanks to some double attacks here, I have to go king f8, giving up my castling rights. Anyways, knight c4, really coming after the d6 square now, and things go sort of from bad to worse pretty quickly for me here. We see knight e5, knight f6, and knight d6 is the nasty idea. And believe it or not, there's just no way for me to defend this f7 pawn. This f7 pawn is going down. It's attacked twice by two knights. Of course, you cannot take the knight due to knight g6 check. So in the game, I played, you know, the rather sad move, king to g8. See knight takes on f7, rook h7, and I would be hard-pressed to remember a time when I had a worse position out of the opening in the Caro-Kann. So Rochelle really hurting me here. And then Rochelle actually castles queenside, which is a bit of a mistake. Whenever you go sort of fishing like this, with your knight out to f7 deep in enemy territory, you should be working on an exit strategy as well. And that's something Rochelle sort of neglected to do here. So I managed to find my way back into the game with the move rook f8 here, when suddenly this knight is entirely trapped. So we see rook d to e1, and then the classic imbalance that I wanted to talk about here tonight, with rook takes f7, knight takes f7, and queen takes f7. So I have succeeded in taking two knights for my one little lonely rook, but the story does not necessarily end there. So I'd like you to think from Rochelle's perspective here about how you would want to continue in this position. Now, it might not seem like the endgame yet, but we are sort of endgame adjacent here, and I want to talk about some decisions Rochelle made that made converting this endgame a lot harder for her than it needed to be. So, both a specific move here for white and sort of in general, what white should be trying to accomplish in this position. What do you guys think? Yeah, nice rook on h7. Everybody loves the rook on h7. So you guys have some pretty good ideas here. I really like the move some people are suggesting, which is the move queen to b8 check. And black sort of has to play the move knight e8 to keep the pawn on b7 defended. And from there, you can expect to see white aiming to activate the rook from h1 with rook h4 or rook h3 and sort of swinging it over to enter the game. Now, this is going to give black a lot of problems because we still have to find some way to activate the rook on h7. Probably black is going to play rook h8 and king h7, and we'll probably be surviving for the moment. This rook is eventually getting back into the game, although the wasted time, of course, is going to allow white to continue to activate and continue to make threats. Now, the important thing to note here is that with the queens on the board, with a lot of pieces for black to worry about, it's a lot more difficult for black to activate this rook and bring it into the game. Now, this is sort of along the right idea. White wants to keep the queens on the board and continue going after the king with the rook against the minor pieces. Now, this is sort of counterintuitive because we're sort of told that the minor pieces are good in the middle game and bad in the end game against the rook. But we'll see that that might not be the case here. Instead, Rochelle goes with queen e5 with the very, very simple idea of taking the pawn on e6. And while this does maintain an edge for white, we'll see that this is a little bit too friendly towards me here. I, of course, play the move rook h8, want to get this rook back into the game, and Rochelle just takes this extra pawn. But now, I think this was, in fact, a poor decision for Rochelle to enter this endgame where I have the two knights against the rook. Why was it a poor decision? Well, because it allows me a lot of opportunity to activate all of my pieces immediately rather than the slow slog / struggle I would have had with the queen applying a lot of pressure. So, sort of a poor decision by Rochelle to actually enter this endgame, in my opinion. Now, we continued here with the move king f7. That's what I played. Rochelle continues with the very natural rook h to e1. And now I have a question for you, chat room. I have a question for you. Black to move here. What should we do with this rook? Or should we not do anything with this rook? Black to move. What do you guys think? What do you think? So yeah, Exquisite Corpse points out that white's advantage was because black was inactive. And now if black activates, it's a chess game. This is true. It's important noting, though, that Rochelle didn't get nothing for the activity that she gave me. She did take this pawn on e6 and now has two pawns in the rook for the two knights. So it was a trade-off by Rochelle. It wasn't, you know, something for nothing. It was something for something, but I don't think it was quite enough for the activity I lacked. And yeah, everybody and myself, we all have the wrong answer, of course, with rook to e8. Rook to e8 is a bad move. It's a bad move. I wish somebody would have told me back in 2016 not to play rook to e8 here, because it is, in fact, pretty objectively just wrong. Now, I'm going to tell you guys a secret that I didn't know until recently, but when you have the two pieces against a rook, you're oftentimes told that in the middle game, they can be super strong. The two pieces can fight very, very well. The rooks often get tangled up in the middle game because there's not enough open files for them to shine. And the closer and closer you get to an endgame, the more powerful the rook gets. Because there's more open files, the rook can move about a bit more freely. And this idea is generally true. But usually it doesn't get more specific than that. In this case, though, I'm going to tell you very specifically, almost 100% of the time, the two pieces are a lot better with a single extra rook on the board. So two pieces plus a rook against two rooks is a lot better for the pieces than it is versus just two pieces versus one rook, right? And the reason for that is sort of multifold here, just like the paper tells. So, why is it that black would prefer to have this extra rook on the board? Well, for one, when you have two rooks on the board, they can often end up being superfluous, that is, serving the same job as each other, when really the job could have been done with just one rook. And that's sort of what we're seeing here, right? White has good control over the e-file, but really, white would still have good control over the e-file if this rook on e6 didn't exist. So believe it or not, the best move here is actually the paradoxical rook to b8, going for passivity, allowing something like rook to e7 check, and just playing with this position with the passive rook. Even this super passive rook is going to be better for black than playing with the knights alone. Now, just to prove it to you, let's play a few more moves. Let's say Well, okay. It's tough to not hang this h5 pawn, but pretending white's not even hanging this pawn, let's play something like f3, knight b to d5, rook e5, and something like knight f4, and g4. Now, the knights have good control over the position. They've done, okay, well, I'm blundering here, blundering a bit. Actually, I'm just blundering everything. So let's say that all these tactics don't even exist, though. Like, let's say that I play b5 here. We see g4, knight f4, king d2. The knights have good control over the position, and they do very, very well at hampering the white rooks from invading, right? They're sort of keeping both rooks at bay, and in the meantime, we sort of have this extra rook here on b8 that black is a little bit more free to play around with. Now, compare this position to a position that you can imagine where the rook on e5 is traded off for the rook on b8. Now, the knights are still keeping this one rook at bay, but they're not really doing much more, right? The knights aren't really enough to make concrete threats on their own, and while they still keep the rook at bay, black doesn't really have this extra piece to move around with. So the point I'm trying to get at here, when possible with the pieces, you want to keep the extra rook on the board. The reason for that is the two rooks for whites are often superfluous, often serve the same job. The knights can sort of play against them in the same way that they could against one rook. This gives black the little bit more freedom that they may need to play around with their own rook. Okay, enough about that though, because I wasn't the super genius chess player that I am now in 2016, and of course I played the natural move rook to e8, saying, oh my god, these rooks are on the e file, it's super scary, let's trade those off. So, really important principle to keep in mind here. The two pieces work well with one rook. The rooks would much prefer to have a sole rook versus two-piece endgame compared to two rooks versus two pieces and a rook in the endgame. Okay, enough about that though. We see rook takes e8, knight takes e8, and g4 by Rochelle, shoring up the kingside weaknesses. Now knight f6 by me, just activating the knight, and we see the move f3. So what's your guys' feeling of this endgame here? We have two extra pawns for whites and the rook against the two minor pieces, the two knights for black. So what do you guys think? Does white have good winning chances? Does black have winning chances? Is it equal? What is sort of the nature of this position here? Elvis feels that white is better. Manny says drawn. Okay, while you guys are thinking about this, though, I will answer a couple of the specific questions. So maybe I didn't do a great job of explaining the threats here. If you play a move like rook to d8, then this is simply a fork. And knight c to d5 isn't enough to stop it, because this is coming anyways after c4. So that's why rook to b8. But anyways, enough about the specifics. The point is the principle. You want the extra rook with black. Rook b8 obviously isn't ideal, but it's sort of the only way to keep the rook without blundering more material. Anonymous person feels black is winning. Manny says the pawns are very powerful, but black has the edge with the two knights. Anyone's game. So it is definitely white with the advantage here. Now, in the middle game, two pawns and the rook for the two pieces can sort of be seen as a little bit more of a fair trade. But as I said, the principle goes, the closer and closer you get to a pure endgame, the more and more powerful the rook gets as opposed to the pieces. And here, the rook is in fact very, very powerful compared to the knights. The knights are a little bit awkward at sort of creating threats against white's structure. Like, if you just think broadly, how is black ever going to try to win the game? You are going to be hard-pressed to come up with an answer. To win the game, you sort of have to make a passed pawn, right? Now, structurally, black just can't make a passed pawn, so black has to win pawns in order to make a passed pawn, right? We somehow have to take the pawn on f3 off the board, and then take the pawn on g4 off the board, and then sort of go g6 and like, win. Right? But it turns out that this is just not really a viable winning plan. There's just no way for black to get after this pawn on f3. In the meantime, let's try to come up with a winning plan for white. What can white try to do to win the game? And that is sort of the question of the endgame. White is going to be better with the extra pawns and the lack of weaknesses in the structure, but can white actually win? What is the winning plan? And that's going to be the question that we're hoping to solve here as Rochelle. We're playing as Rochelle against me. A little bit different than normal, yeah, but it's a little bit more interesting than Black's play, I think. So, in the game, Black plays the move knight b to d5, and as I've scrolled too far, White starts with the move c4. Not spoiling too much yet. We see knight f4, king d2, knight e6, and king up to c3. Just defending all the pawns rather easily. Now we have the move king to e7. Okay, so let's pause here and talk about the winning plan for White. What should White try to do here to win this chess game? How can we try to win this chess game? What do you think, chat room? Broadly, not specific moves yet. So everybody sort of has the right idea here. You need to create a passed pawn, and the way to do that is to expand yes on the queen side and yes on the king side. So White's winning plan has to be to break through on either side of the board and create a passed pawn. Now what this means for Black is that your drawing idea is going to be to keep a good grip on both sides of the board at the same time, which can be rather difficult when working with the knights being such short-range pieces. So I really actually do think Rochelle did a good job here trying to press in the game with b4. This is just a good start to the position. You don't actually have to figure out all the details from the start. You just want to start by gaining a little bit of extra space, as Rochelle does here. I played king d6, and she plays a4. So far, nothing has been spoiled. Now, sensing that b5 might be coming, right? If b5 here, for example, Black is happy to take, play knight d5, and completely take over in front of this pawn. No real problems here for Black. So a4 is now sort of threatening to go with something like this, right? And taking over the d5 square as well, with some fluidity in the structure for White. If White achieves something like this, then I think White is, in fact, simply going to be winning. The reason being, if Black tries to do really anything special, we can do a number of things. Let's just defend first. Black passes. And eventually, White, I think, is going to break with d5 and just start invading here. And these pawns are a little bit too powerful. A protected passed pawn is going to be quite strong here for White. And let's not forget, while White is gaining all this space, we can still create threats over here and create threats of f4 and g5 if Black gets a little bit too comfortable. So threats everywhere on the board, the knights aren't going to be able to handle it. So in an effort to stop this, I play the move a6 with Black. And here, chat room, I would like you guys to come up with another move for White. What should White play in this position? It's a actually really critical move here. So really critical move here. What should White do? What should White do in this position, and why? So a couple people have the correct answer. So Chess King is actually suggesting what Rochelle did in the game, but it actually comes with a pretty serious mistake. So it's important to recognize Black's defensive ideas along with our offensive ideas. So you guys are suggesting a lot of great moves for offense, like rook to e5, just trying to further our plan by controlling more squares and activating our pieces. But Black is actually creating a threat with the move a6, and that threat is to play the move b5. With b5, we're going to see a lot of simplifications, and we're going to see Black taking control of the really important d5 square. If Black is able to control this square, then we're going to be able to blockade pretty much White's entire position by controlling f4 from d5, by blockading the d pawn on d4, and that's sort of the end of the story, right? There's not much you can do, right? So for example, rook e5 was played in the game, and this would have actually allowed the move b5, and after some simplifications, for example, something like this, we have the intermezzo, knight d5 check. King c4 would be a bit of a mistake because you can't actually go taking this guy because of the d4 pawn. So king d3 or b3, for example. And black is able to take back on b5, blockade everything with the knights on d5. And the more you look at this position, the less progress you're actually going to make. There's really just no way through here. So b5 was the threat by black, and the correct way to stop it is with a5. And after this, it's going to be a long and hard fight ahead for black, but I think this is really the only way to continue pressing for the win here with white. And you have to play a5, with the point being now b5 is running into a takes b6 with, well, for the moment, an extra pawn, and again, activity down the a file, right? You need threats on both sides of the board, and against b5, we have a takes b6 for that. So a5, really, really important move here. Never lose sight of your opponent's defensive plans. That could change the structure irreversibly and sort of throw away all your winning chances. Rook e5 played in the game, though, and me being a patzer just plays the move knight c7. No idea what I'm doing. I think I was worried about hanging a pawn to just white capturing on b5, missing this knight to d5 intermezzo. So I played knight to d7, knight to c7. Now, of course, it should be pretty clear what white's best move is to the chat here. Of course, white should play a5 again, just preventing this idea of b5. But aside from a5, Rochelle comes up with another really interesting idea here. Once again, the key for white has to be to make threats on both sides of the board to stretch black a little bit thin. And the way she goes about doing this is with the move g5. Still not really giving me time for b5. I take on g5, of course. We see rook takes g5. And now, despite giving herself a few more weaknesses on h5 and f3, Rochelle has succeeded in creating another target for herself on the g7 pawn. I continue now with knight e6. We see rook to f5. And I continue just passing the time. So, white to move here, chat room. How would you continue now with white? Let's find the next active plan, or at least limiting plan for white here. How do you want to continue? Rook g6 feels evil. Well, rook g6 might hang a pawn, right? Might hang a pawn. All right, we have 3 votes for d5. Any votes for any other pawn moves? 1 vote for b5. Would have been pinned to the king? I disagree. I disagree. Right? g6. Knight takes here. I have a knight here. You can't really do this. I'll take it. I don't know. All right, we've got a couple votes for b5 now, few votes for a5, 1 vote for c5, and yeah, that's sort of the question here. So these, in my opinion, are all reasonable moves. c5, not the most reasonable move, because again, the d5 square is just sort of too important to give up here. So d5, b5, and a5, all perfectly reasonable moves. Now, the one that I sort of prefer the most here with white is, in fact, going to be the move a5. And the reason for this is that it sits on the position. If you play a move like b5 or d5, you should calculate a lot. You should calculate a lot before allowing the position to simplify. So if you play something like b5 here, yes, it might immediately be good, but if you don't get something concrete out of it, the position is going to tend toward a more simple type of position where black is able to consolidate a little bit more easily. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we can actually see in the game, because Rochelle did decide to play the move b5. So, b5 played in the game. I played a takes b5. See a takes b5. Now, knight c7 is a nice defensive idea. The point being, we are still not interested in playing something like c takes b5, when white would again be gaining control over really important squares and being able to push 2 pawns together, but instead forcing white to do something with this pawn, or if white allows us to capture, forcing her to take back with the pawn, again giving us this nice little blockade here on d5. Perhaps b6 first, though, would be quite relevant to keep the king out. Okay, so knight c7 played in the game, and maybe this is something that Rochelle had either missed or not thought all the way through, because after b takes c6, b takes c6, king b4, she has tried to, as Dvoretsky would put it, quote, widen the beachhead. Widen the beach. Dvoretsky loves that phrase. I don't know if anybody's read Dvoretsky's Endgame manual, but this is like his favorite phrase in the entire world. Widening the beachhead, in a sense, giving the king a path into the game. But the expense of that has come at leaving herself with 2 pawns that are going to be tough to keep track of if your king goes exploring here on the queen side. And black now doesn't really have any weaknesses to keep track of, aside from the c6 pawn, which is easily defended by the king. So in her attempt to widen the beachhead, perhaps she actually narrowed the beachhead, because now all black has to keep track of is the c6 pawn, whereas before there were a lot more pawns to try and keep track of. So how should white have continued? Again, I think this move a5 is actually probably the best way to go about it. And is it enough to win? I'm not so sure, but it does, for the moment, keep the tension, and it allows black some opportunities to sort of mess up. We can play this position kind of forever with white, moving the king back and forth, moving the rook back and forth, creating threats over here, always hinting at playing a move like b5, even a move like d5. And yeah, the game would continue. Instead, though, we see b5, a takes b5, a takes b5, knight c7, take on c6, take on c6, king b4, but unfortunately, after knight e6, the king has nothing better than to return back to c3. And here we begin the great shuffle. Rook a5, but nothing really doing. And black is just going to repeat forever, as I did in the game. And at the end of the day, I miraculously escaped with a draw. Now, I think actually the game went on a lot longer than this because Rochelle just kept like moving back and forth, not wanting to give me a draw. I think I actually claimed 3-fold repetition amongst the king shuffling back and forth. I don't even know if I claimed it properly, but Rochelle sort of just believed me and had given up on the position, I think, because there's really nothing left to do for white here. For example, if you ever try to play the move d5, I'm simply going to capture it, go, I think even just knight c7, and there's no good way to save this. Even knight takes d5 here is enough for a draw. Pretty easily. I just come take this pawn, and that'll be the game. So nothing really left to do with white, and the game was agreed to a draw by me claiming 3-fold repetition. At some point, I think more moves were played, just shuffling back and forth, but nothing happened. So questions on this endgame before I do a brief review, because I thought there was some really important stuff. There was some really important stuff to go over here. Was my rating this tournament? I think I was around 2020 or something. So still better than the target audience of this class, but it was 4 years ago, and I still was not quite as experienced in my Caro-Kann. Going on Twitch at 8 p.m. Central Time, Elvis. So 25 more minutes, top of the hour. At what point could white have forced a win still? Well, I'm not so sure that white could have ever just forced a win strictly ending the game. In the end game, I would say white's best opportunity was to play the move a5, sort of at this juncture, and sit on the position a little bit more. I think g5 was a good idea to try and create threats on the king's side, but it did also saddle white with some more weaknesses that weren't entirely necessary. Whereas a5 here just sort of does the mean thing and leaves black to his own devices while she can maneuver around as long as she desires. So I think this would have been the best winning try in the endgame. Definitely earlier on, though, there were some ideas missed here. I think probably white would have been strictly winning with the clever move of c4 in the opening because this is pretty much the only way to get this knight evacuated out through d6. For example, rook f8, c5, and the knight would be able to evacuate, not giving me this 2 pieces for a rook advantage that I got in the game. So if you want to say forced to win, maybe something like this would have given white some really, really good chances. But as far as the endgame, I'm not convinced it was ever entirely lost. All right, so to recap, what have we learned from this endgame? Number 1, as far as the endgame goes, really, really useful for the side with the 2 pieces to keep an extra rook on the board. White's rooks often end up being superfluous, serving the same job as each other, and black's rook can very often move with a little bit more freedom, as the knights or a knight and a bishop even can help hamper both rooks at the same time. Number 2, how do you win in these types of endgames? Well, you should attempt to create a passed pawn and more directly create threats on both sides of the board, trying to stretch the opponent's forces thin and then finding a way to break through. In this case, though, stout defense by Caleb Denby with the 2 knights was able to hold on to it. With that in mind, let's move on to some real chess players, such as one Magnus Carlsen. So we're going to see how Magnus treated a similar endgame against one Ivan Cheparinov. So without further ado, let's just jump into it. Nobody cares about this entire game. This is not the endgame that I am looking for. Still not the endgame I'm looking for. Okay, some more pieces coming off the board now. All right, I want to see one more trade maybe. Can we get one more trade, Magnus? And there you go. And we have arrived at our target endgame. So, what's going on here? What's going on here? Once again, we have 2 pieces in exchange for the rook. In this case, though, white does have a knight and a bishop rather than 2 knights. And again, we actually see black with 2 extra pawns for this imbalance of the rook versus the 2 pieces. So, what's the same and what's different? Well, of course, the pawn structure is different. The pieces themselves are slightly different, but I'm still curious what you guys think about the evaluation of this position. Is Magnus better, as Rochelle was against me, or is Magnus actually perhaps on the worst side of things in this endgame? What do you think? Anwar says black is better. Bold claims, bold claims. Black's slight advantage because of the passed pawn opportunities. Black's better, 50-50. D4 is strong. White is better. So I tend to actually favor the white pieces in this position because a lot of things are drastically different from the last position that we looked at. We have the obvious differences that I sort of listed out, but more subtly is something that somebody in the chat actually brought up, although incorrectly. Black actually doesn't have as many passed pawn opportunities in this game compared to what we were looking at in the last game. Mainly because, as Manny pointed out, I believe the pawn on d4 is quite strong, and we have, the existence of a dark squared bishops. And bishops control one color complex very, very well, and the other color complex not at all. In this case, for black to make a passed pawn, you would have to break through on one of these dark squares that the bishop can help control. So it's going to be a difficult task ahead for black to actually create a passed pawn. Number 2, this pawn on c7 is very clearly backwards, and it's not going to be easy to make it sort of unbackwards. And number 3, white's pieces have a little bit of activity. They're well coordinated, and for the moment, black's rook is not exactly looking the most active either. So for the moment, I would actually rather have the white pieces in this position. That's not to say black isn't without chances, as you can probably see by the result of the game, but white is definitely well in it. And let's see what happens first and foremost here. We have king e8, rook d8 by Magnus, now king e2. So Magnus's next move is pretty intuitive, I think, and also a little bit instructive. So as the people in the chat were saying, and as I've mentioned in the previous case, oftentimes the only way to try to win these kinds of positions is to make a passed pawn. So Magnus starts gearing up for this kind of idea with the move f6. Not necessarily looking to play e5 immediately or even in the near future, but number one, hampering this knight, not allowing it to get to e5, and also introducing some ideas of playing e5 in the future. We see king d2 by Cheparinov, we see king f7, king c2, and now I would like you to guess Magnus Carlsen's next few moves here. So you're playing with the black pieces. You're probably not necessarily any better. At this point, though, I don't think white can claim to be playing for a win with the way white has played the last few moves, just bringing the king to the queen side to guard the entry squares. Not exactly, you know, a stunning revelation that is playing for the win. But how can you try and fight for more as Magnus here? Maybe rook b8, only open file. So a lot of people say rook b8. Rook b8, rook b8. Rook h8 by Faust. Rook e8 and then e5. So a lot of good ideas here. The idea I actually like the least is the move rook to b8. So rook b8 I don't think is doing a very good job of fighting for the win. Now why not? Well, it's because white has actually controlled the first 6 squares on the b file, right? And due to the nature of having 2 pieces against the rook, black is not really in a position to play an exchange sacrifice, if you know what I mean. So you're never really making any progress along the b file here. So it's better for the moment to leave the rook a little bit more flexible. You might actually want to bring it to a square like e8 or h8, but you don't really know which of those squares you would prefer yet. So what Magnus does over the next few moves is an idea some people have mentioned, which is h5. Magnus actually is about to play h4 and h3. And this is a great way to apply some pressure to the opponent. It's very, very similar to the a5 idea that we took a look at in the previous game. In this case, though, it's not even necessarily a preventative measure, like a5 was preventing b5. In this case, Magnus is just taking the extra space and creating an opportunity for himself to have not only a passed pawn in the future, but a very, very strong passed pawn. So let's continue on here. If white were to try something like h4, that allows Magnus the opportunity to actually, 1, create a passed pawn on the queen side if white dares to capture on g5, or 2, create another open file, another much more useful open file in the g file by taking on h4 and then bringing the rook in to activity in this manner. So h4, not really a playable idea for white. Instead, white goes bishop to a3. And then we see Magnus using again this leverage to gain even more space. We see g4 and now h3 by Magnus. So really fun stuff by the world champion already. Without fear, just launching the pawn down the board, using the fact that white isn't really able to allow the opening of more files in order to create some weaknesses in the white camp, right? You see how these pawns are a little bit more disjointed now. By creating these weaknesses in the structure, Magnus gives himself this little bit of play on both sides of the board to use the rook effectively. Now we see bishop b2 by Cheparinov, which again, white is sort of now playing without a plan. White had decided, I think, pretty early on that it was going to be a defensive-minded game in the end game from white here, choosing not really to play for more. Magnus now plays some slower moves with king to e7. We see knight c5, and actually rook a8, just as a defensive measure. Perhaps this bishop is coming to c3 to put some pressure. We do see bishop to c3, and now, surprisingly, Magnus is quite willing to give up this a5 pawn with king to d6. This actually allows a bit of a tactic here with bishop takes a5, when rook takes a5 is unplayable due to the move of knight b7. So perhaps I was actually being a little bit too harsh on Cheparinov. His moves did have an idea. The idea was to come capture on a5. So what's the downside to taking on a5? Well, number one, of course, Magnus has managed to create weaknesses over here. And number two, by diverting the dark square bishop away from the center, now is going to be the opportune moment for Magnus to start breaking free in the center of the board with the move e5. we see white play bishop to b4, but Magnus has cleverly placed the pieces so that the discoveries don't really matter. And we see e takes on d4, king d3, and king to c6. Okay, king takes d4 played in the game, and once again, it is Magnus on the move here. So we have some pretty serious changes to the position over the past few moves. Magnus spent a lot of time playing h5, h4, h3 to provoke weaknesses on the king side, so allowed white this opportunity to come take off the a5 pawn, but now white has been forced to release the grip on the center in exchange. So was it all worth it? Was it all worth it for black? Is black still in the driver's seat here, or has something slipped? How to continue, chat room? How to continue? So yeah, everybody has the right idea here with rook to e8. The rook, yes, does thrive on open files, but again, the difference here compared to rook b8 earlier is that Magnus is actually threatening to invade this time. We see the weak e2 square is now undefended, and it forces a concession by white to play the move king d3 to defend it. Whereas before, rook b8, there were no invasion points, so it didn't really have a purpose. All right, so we see the move rook e8, king d3 by white, and now Magnus does something pretty cool. He just plays the move g6 and says, all right, your turn. So I think a lot of players, myself included, would be a little bit nervous about the prospect of allowing this a-pawn to run down the board, but of course here, Magnus realizes that giving up the b5 square is not really something that white is allowed to do just yet. So, excuse me, a5 not on the cards for white just yet, which is why we see a little rerouting of this knight. But this comes at the cost of allowing the rook in to e4. See knight d4 check, king b6, f3 to defend, and now rook back to e8. Okay. So white plays the move knight to b3. Now we see rook a8 by Magnus, which I'm going to level with you. It's a little bit mysterious to me, rook a8. Okay, I guess it's trying to force some action on the queen side by white. Provoking a5, king b5 again would be good for black, but white can just play the move knight c5, keeping everything under control. Now we see the move king to c6, and this is the moment when things, I think, start to go a little bit crazy here. So white, for the moment, seemingly has an okay grip on the position, but it's sort of left in the balance here, where if white ever wants to make use of this a-pawn, it comes at the price of allowing the black king to invade, and that's sort of just too hefty a price to pay. Now we see the move, though, king to d4, and this allows Magnus again to shuffle back to e8, and after king to d3, Magnus plays sort of the craziest move of the game here. So who could come up with some ways to continue the position with black in this case? What could we do? Wasn't this a blitz game? I believe it was a rapid game in the World Cup. I might be wrong, though. So a lot of people have Magnus's move, and a couple people actually have what I think is the best move. So Magnus came up with the rather crazy move d4, which I'm a little bit undersold on, to be honest with you. But I think the best move here is actually the move f5. With the rook, you want to open as many files as possible, because at some point, the white pieces cannot control every single invasion point. We saw Magnus open the e file for this reason, and forcing the white king to make concessions to stop rook to e2. But after f5, now white is in the very, very awkward spot of having to open the g file, which is going to prove a much more difficult file to keep closed. And once again, this is only relevant because Magnus shoved this pawn onto h3 much, much earlier on. Now h2 is a permanent weakness, and if the rook can just invade, we'll see some success for Magnus Carlsen. Now, why is this a better way than with d4? Well, if white were to play king takes d4, that would be a pretty bad mistake, and black would just win. But white does have this move of knight to b3, and the story is a lot more complex now. If you want to play something like rook to e3 check, you're running into king c4. Don't even think about rook takes f3 because of knight takes d4 check. So instead, we actually see the move king d5 by Magnus Carlsen, and now white is actually able to capture on d4. This does come at a price, though, with the move c5, temporarily forking both pieces, but now knight b5 is threatening a counter fork. So at the end of the day, the dust settles, and we have this position. And this is where the real genius of the endgame comes to play. So again, I believe this was a rapid game, and Magnus perhaps messed up some of the tactics there with the move d4, but now we have this position. And I'm not going to lie to you, now definitely white is better again. Magnus was playing a very, very strong, very good endgame, using the threats against the h2 pawn to his advantage, but he did miss the knockout blow with f5. f5 would have led to a good position for black. That was the correct way to invade. Here, though, the tactics worked out in white's favor, and the position is sort of deeply simplified. So, why is white better? Well, black's only passed pawn is now this pawn on c5, and moves like f5 are coming with a lot less threat now that the bishop has successfully rerouted back to a more defensive square. For example, we could even do something like g takes f5, g takes f5, and now white is quite comfortably able to defend the weakness on h2, sort of without hassle. So instead, we see Magnus play rook a8, hitting the pawn on a4. Knight to c3 is simple enough. Now rook d8 check, king c2, and c4. So Magnus pushing this pawn as far up as it will go. We see knight to e2, rook into d3 is pretty obvious. You want to invade with the rook whenever possible, highlighting white's weaknesses on the king side. Bishop out to c3, king to b7, and now knight to d4. And this is where white has actually let the advantage slip. Amazingly, the best way to keep the advantage is with the crazy move knight to g1, which looks a little bit silly at first, putting the knight on g1, but at the end of the day, Magnus has made his own weakness by pushing this pawn to h3, and is going to be a little bit hard-pressed to justify having this pawn here with threats of knight takes h3 coming, and also threats of bishop takes f6 coming. So this would have been the way for white to press the advantage, and it's going to be pretty tough here for black to continue. Instead, though, we see knight d4, trying to defend while activating the knight centrally. Now simply king to a6 is Magnus Carlsen's response, and white has somehow sort of put all the pieces into jail because none of them can really comfortably move. For those reasons, we see white push to a5, and now we finally see f5 by black, breaking things open for the rook. g5 by white tries to keep things closed, and now we see once again Magnus playing f4, the most combative move. And this is the takeaway that I want you to have from this game. If you learn nothing else from this game, notice Magnus's willingness to just shove these pawns forward, leaving them undefended in order to create weaknesses for him to target with the rook on the king side. Invading is no good if the rook isn't able to munch on some of these pawns. So Magnus ensures that the rook invasion is always threatening by keeping these pawns weak. If Magnus had instead played some kind of passing move like king to b7, white could very seriously consider playing a move like f4 and shoring up some of these weaknesses. Right now, g6 is also going to be weak. We no longer have to worry about the pawn on f3, and once again, on a very sunny day, you can imagine white even somehow putting this bishop on g3, defending all the weaknesses, and giving the knight sort of free rein to roam around. Okay. Instead, though, f4 by Magnus, we see king b2 by Cheparinov, kind of unable to move any of the pieces, and now rook to d1, and Magnus is quite close to winning again, with rook h1 being an unstoppable threat. King a3, rook h1, bishop d2, take on h2, take on f4, and now rook d2, and Magnus is close to winning. Knight c6 played in the game, and rook d3 check picks up another pawn. We see knight b4 check, and Cheparinov is sort of all in on the a pawn now, but it's not going to be enough. It's just not going to be enough. Magnus picks up this pawn. We see king b7, king a6, and all the pawns come tumbling down. We see h4, and this endgame is, or sorry, h2 rather, and this endgame is pretty easily winning here. The king is just going to come in, and the rook has successfully stopped both the king and the knight from interfering with the pawn. So it all came crashing down relatively quickly there with just one mistake by Cheparinov. And again, the point I really wanted to highlight in this game is Magnus's first h5, h4, h3, and then even later f5, f4, shutting down White's mobility on the king's side and locking in these weaknesses so that the rook invasions were meaningful. And this just goes to show you the difference between a player like Magnus Carlsen and players like myself and Rochelle Wu. Magnus sort of is able to balance all these things a lot better and actually get results out of them. So, questions on this game before we call it a night here on the YouTube classes. Questions here. All right, well, I think I'm about ready to call it a night then on the Endgame class. If you're watching live, please do join us on Twitch for another edition of Analyze Your Games, the class where I analyze your games. If you've had enough chess for the night, or if you're watching the replay, I want to thank you very much for watching. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.